Nation, everyone. Chief, have you been on your TikTok account today?
As a matter of fact, not today, but
Do you have
I did.
TikTok?
I do.
Okay, I
I
thought
do.
you
By the
did
way,
not.
reluctantly,
Right,
reluctantly, our technical geniuses there in the background really persuaded me to use TikTok a couple of years ago. So here I am with it. Yeah.
right. So yeah, I have TikTok, and it was down for a bit, back up now. We're going to get into that today. We're going to talk about TikTok, why a law was passed, in essence, banning it, and why it's once again active. And maybe we'll speculate a little bit, or I wouldn't call it speculation. Maybe we'll try to apply some common sense and read the tea leaves and see where this thing's going. Is TikTok something that will be available in the United States going forward in a couple months? Right now, there's like a 75-day reprieve, and a couple days ticked off that since the executive order. And we'll get into all this. But yeah, that's today's discussion, Mark, is
Mhm.
TikTok. Now, I think the first thing to talk about, I guess, is why it was banned in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's owned by a company called ByteDance. And I don't know if you have done a lot of research on ByteDance. I don't know too much about them other than that they are a Chinese company.
Yeah.
And there was serious concerns about a social media platform being run by a Chinese company. And it got to the point where it was called a national security threat. And I guess what I found interesting about this, Mark, and I don't know if you saw anything different, was the descriptions of the threat are somewhat vague. And by the way, we've it's interesting because you and I have talked about these things before. We've
Mhm.
talked about privacy concerns with regard to smartphones. That was maybe darn near a year ago, Mark, that we talked about that. And we talked about what information your smartphone collects on you and the various apps in your smartphone collect on you and what happens with that information. Um, we've also talked about lawmaking by executive order or policy memorandum, and that's something that in this case is an issue. Uh, but interesting that as far as I could see, there was really never any very specific information about this national security threat, even in a classified briefing. As a matter of fact, there was one point where one of the senators who attended a classified briefing came out and said it's just very vague. Said,
Mhm.
that it's very vague. Now, my 2 cents, and Mark, let me read something from the New York Times that was just, about a week ago that this came out, just to kind of set the background of the national security threat, okay?
Mhm.
And again, New York Times article, it was January 17th. The Biden administration has accused China's main intelligence services of burrowing deep inside the American utility grid and more recently into the complex networks run by 9 of the country's telecommunications firms. The first operation, they contend, is designed to give Chinese authorities the capability to turn off electric power or water pipelines in case of a military confrontation over Taiwan. And the second operation, called Salt Typhoon, has enabled Chinese intelligence agents to listen in on some phone calls and even get inside the government system for conducting surveillance of suspected spies. So, this is the backdrop. The cyber threat of adversaries is very real right now. Um, is like, I think, Mark, just in general terms, without even talking about TikTok specifically,
Right.
how much of a concern is this cyber threat to you? Are you and I still of the generation where, we're looking at missiles pointed this way and we're not necessarily in tune with the tech world and the threats that come from quietly working behind the scenes and infiltrating um, the technical aspects of our life and what controls basically our life? And man, this is when you hear about a Chinese government talking about being able to turn off water pipelines
Mhm.
with what we saw a couple of weeks ago, or what we're still seeing actually in your old town of Altadena and Pacific Palisades here in California. Scary.
It is
Like,
scary.
where does this threat sit with you?
Well, here's the thing, Bill. I am not a technical person, and I don't understand, quite frankly, and probably don't appreciate the threats, through cyber espionage. I believe they are real, but then when I say I don't appreciate them, in other words, my level of understanding probably does not do the threat justice. It's probably far worse than I think, and I think there's plenty of logic behind why I believe that, and I like to give the audience a comparison or analogy. When you go back, 100 years, the battleship from various countries, it was the preeminent naval threat, defense, first and last line of defense in naval conflicts. And then you fast forward about 20 years later, we get into World War II, they were almost overnight made obsolete by the aircraft carrier. It was this absolute stark, massive jump in technology and strategy. And that's what we have to think about here. What are the strategies of our foes and our own strategies to repel them and to deal with them? And the aircraft carrier almost really, in a couple of years, made the battleship obsolete. And that's why the last ones were built in 1944. We built the
Wow.
very last battleships anywhere in the world in 1944. And to this day, the aircraft carrier is now the predominant, naval defensive mechanism. And that's probably going to be made obsolete pretty soon with some of these high tech weapons.
Mhm.
But any military, any government that wants to expand itself, wants to attack a foe, wants to defend itself, has to be looking at anything they can cyber wise, because it's no longer the future, it is today. And so the question is, to what extent and the examples you gave about shutting off power grids and water systems, because everything is done through uh, virtual command now. Everything is done through online sources, electronic sources, smart systems, now artificial intelligence. And those who control those systems control their enemies.
Yeah, that's it. I agree with you, man. I think it's a huge threat. And the thing is, when in the Cold War, let's say we knew, I think to some extent, the American people knew what our nuclear capabilities were. And, if you lived in the Midwest, you knew there was a missile silo down the street or something to that effect. We really don't know what the US government is doing in this area proactively right now, right? Is the US government attempting the same type of infiltration that they've accused the Chinese government of? We don't know.
I
And
hope
so
so.
right, but I think that could make it. Hey, with your example with the battleship, you could see a battleship. That was a tangible thing. We knew we had X number of battleships. There's no hiding them. This is a little more in the shadows, and it's a little more secretive, and it probably makes me and a lot of other people feel a little bit more uneasy because we just don't know what we're doing, and we don't know if we have the same capability, right?
Correct. We don't know. And,
Yeah,
and again, as much as we want our government to be transparent, there are a lot of things that I don't want to know. In other words, I want them to be as top secret as possible, because if I know about them, then our adversaries know about them.
right, for sure. So what's the threat from a social media? Now, first off, I think TikTok has like 170 million users in the US. That's a
That's right.
huge number when you look at what the population of the US is now. And I don't know, 330 million, 360 million. I don't know, something in that ballpark.
Hmm.
A huge number of users here. Let's call that a big footprint. So, what can social media or really any media do, Mark, that we've seen over the past 5 years as far as creating a narrative, as far as suppressing information, right? Would you agree that media and social media have the ability to do that?
Well, absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no threat. I mean, no threat. There's no doubt about that.
Right. So I guess you have something that has a huge footprint. the ability to push a specific agenda. And one of the concerns on TikTok is, could it be used by the Chinese government as a propaganda tool? Now, even subtly, even subtly, as far as directing, or I shouldn't say directing, influencing elections, pushing specific candidates, pushing policies, creating distrust in the United States by highlighting specific narratives that are, positive, or that reinforce their message. I mean, look at the issues with Taiwan.
Mhm.
What is on TikTok with regard to Taiwan? I guarantee a Taiwan independence movement, right, would not be something that would be pushed on TikTok right now. And I think if we did research, that would probably play out. I don't know, but I think it would. And that's just kind of common sense, right?
It is
Um,
common sense.
yeah.
Go ahead, Bill. You want to finish
No,
your
no, go
thought?
ahead.
When we first started the show today, I talked about our producers back there that told us how important TikTok was as far as reaching people, as far as getting your message out, being accessible. Because, like you said, about 170 million Americans use TikTok, and if we wanted to get our word out, then we need to use this app. And of course, my reluctance to use it was the same concerns are being talked about now, about the application being used by a foreign adversary to obtain, gather Americans' information, and then somehow use that, not specifically necessarily against the individuals, but to use it against the United States in some way or form. I'm still torn with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be very transparent. I look at this bill as this is really a battle and a balancing act between the First Amendment and national security. It's not the first time that we have dealt with such issues. It is different in the sense of the magnitude, the size, the access to applications of communication, and what is the threat to the First Amendment versus what is the threat to national security. Now, I just want to go back a little bit, if you don't mind, lay a little bit of a foundation about this, because this is all about a law that was passed just last year in 2024.
Right.
And I'm just paraphrasing from a paragraph I'm reading here from it's from SCOTUS blog, is the name of the publication, but it was to bar the use of apps controlled by foreign adversaries. So first of all, somebody, whether I guess it's the president, national security, whatever it is, has to designate someone a foreign adversary. But controlled by foreign adversaries of the United States, including China. More specifically, the law defines apps controlled by foreign adversaries to include any app run by TikTok or ByteDance. Now, this is something I find very important. And Bill, this is the reason I wanted to hit this, because you brought this up earlier, and I think it's so important what you brought up about, in other words, it's kind of vague about what the threat is.
Right.
I want people to really appreciate the fact that all 9 Supreme Court justices voted to ban the use of TikTok in this country, as long as it's owned by the Chinese government. How often does that happen?
That's a good
That
point.
we get a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. Now, again, by the way, that happens a lot, but really on quote unquote minor issues that we never read about, in the paper. But on something of this magnitude, where it does involve curtailing to some extent the First Amendment. You have all 9, that political spectrum, all 9 justices voted to ban TikTok, as long as it's owned by the Chinese government. The question is, what were those justices told? And this goes to your point, your question earlier, Bill. What do those justices know about the danger of TikTok that we don't know about? We get to hear arguments by lawyers in the Supreme Court. We can't see it. We get to read about it, and we get to read the transcripts of the arguments. But what we don't know is what we don't know. The justices have every right to bring people into a SCIF or into another secure setting to get information they feel that they don't need or should not reveal to the American people. And I just wonder, what is it that got all 90 to say, this has got to stop as long as the Chinese government owns it? I find it very fascinating, and it's very compelling to me that they believe the threats to the United States through this application outweigh the curtailment of First Amendment rights.
That's a fascinating point, and because I was trying to dig deep and get to what that is, right? The only thing that I could find, and I saw it repeatedly, was this reference, and I don't know, this could be propaganda in itself, right?
Mhm.
Was a quote, something to the effect that even in classified sessions, so even in essence in a SCIF, the type of meeting you're talking about, even in classified sessions, the danger has only been described in vague terms. So, how do you get from that, if that's the case, to all 9 justices signing on to this? But then the other side of it is maybe just what's described in maybe just the vague terms is enough. Maybe that's enough of a threat. And when it comes to being able to control a significant media outlet in this country, I mean, I'm gonna call TikTok a media outlet for these purposes, right?
Yeah, and I would too.
That's part of it. And then listen to this is 2 things I pulled, one from BuzzFeed News and a second from Forbes, right? BuzzFeed reported in June that China-based ByteDance employees have repeatedly accessed non-public data, like phone numbers and birthdays, of TikTok users, right? I
Mhm.
mean, that's interesting. I wouldn't say that in and of itself is a national security threat, right? Your own personal information. Separately, Forbes reported in October that ByteDance planned to use TikTok to monitor the personal location of some specific American citizens. That's a pretty serious accusation there. So
It
that
is.
sounds like something that could actually rise to the level of a national security threat if a company is going to use uh, this app to track specific individuals and their whereabouts in the United States. Now, ByteDance denied this, just to be clear on that. They said that's not the case. But, we did a show about this, about, I don't know, I call it ad data. And that is all the data that's collected on your phone. And, people should remember that if an app is open in the background on your phone or whatever, it's probably always collecting information on you.
Yeah,
And
and Bill, I remember that show, and you dug real deep into the weeds about that. About, hey, Mark, all the settings about allow access or limited access or no access. We find out you can put no access, and it's still tracking your
mhm.
whereabouts. You made that point clear, and I'm glad you brought that up again.
Yeah, so that's a major, the ability to track people is a major issue with any app. Um, and, even, I think one of the examples we gave when we talked about this was just setting up, uh, tracking or being aware of all the users of, let's say, TikTok on a military base,
Mhm.
right? They have all the information, they have location information, they know these people are on a military base. And all of a sudden, all those users all of a sudden appear in a different part of the world. You know, an
Right.
adversary can easily determine, okay, that military unit is now deployed, and here's where they are. And it's so that's part of it is all the information that's collected on a phone. How can that be used against us? And it most definitely can be used against us. A couple a couple quotes, Mark, and let me know if you have, what your thoughts are on these. Now, this is
Mhm.
a guy named Lindsay Gorman, managing director and senior fellow, German Marshall Fund's technology program. I'm quite honestly not sure what that is. Allowing an entity accountable to the CCP, that's Chinese Communist Party, to decide who is shown what content and when is the height of folly. So this guy's point is just the propaganda point of it, right? You
Mhm.
cannot let an adversary control an algorithm that chooses to push or suppress content.
Mhm.
And that's, I think we've already talked about that, but anything further on that point?
No, I think the key word here, not just to this specific point, but for the entire show and discussion is adversary,
Uh-huh.
because we go back to all of these applications, whether it's Facebook or it's Instagram, you name them. We know they're all tracking your movements, your habits, your purchase habits, things like this. And this is why the law and the ruling made by the Supreme Court all focuses around adversaries, enemies of the United States. Um, that's the difference, and
Hmm.
I think it's an important, obviously, distinction. Otherwise, we'd have if it's strictly based on information being used by these platforms to find out more about you, they'd all have to be shut down, right?
Right.
And that's
That's
not the
just
case.
gonna,
It's like
yeah.
it is are the people who want to see the demise of the United States of America using the information against us. That's the only difference here, and obviously it is a fundamental and important difference. And and by the way, I have reluctantly come to the conclusion, the position, because earlier on I was a strict First Amendment
Hmm.
um, opponent of any suppression, and you know, but I'm telling you right now, Bill, just watching that again, going back to these nine justices who could not be more diverse in philosophies and so many important things, all coming together on this. I'm thinking,
Yeah.
what? That's a lot of smoke there, and there's probably fire as well.
Yeah. Here's another quote that kind of expands on that point you just talked about, Mark. Susan Landau, professor of cybersecurity and policy, Department of Computer Science at Tufts University. Data collected from user smartphones and apps tracks where individuals go, whom they are with, and what they are doing. The data is then shared with a vast array of data brokers. People's most private information, their relationships, their locations, and their activities and interests can easily be discerned from these profiles. While TikTok's consumer data can easily be shared with China, even without such access, U.S. adversaries can create front companies in friendly nations and simply buy that data like thousands of others do. And we talked about that in our show, how this data is packaged and sold by these data brokers. So is it beneficial for a foreign adversary to have this direct link into uh, all this data? Data is power, Mark. Is it
Yeah.
that much more beneficial than just having to set up a front company and buying the data? I think it is. Am I wrong about that?
No, I couldn't agree more that it's beneficial the way you described it, the way you quoted it there, Bill. And the other thing is too is again, when you're looking at the valuation of TikTok, that what is it now? Maybe $1 trillion or something. I'm not sure, but it's over $500 billion in
Right.
valuation, I believe. The reason I bring that up is because, in other words, we don't have to necessarily separate one aspect of this from the other. In other words, the financial um, revenue side from the adversarial side of it. Both can be true, and I think for China,
Hmm.
and it's I would love to get into this about about ownership of companies and things like this, but of course China has a financial hand in every single business that is based in China. Every single business.
Great
They have
point.
a
Yep.
financial hand. They have a financial, I'll use the word partnership, but I think interest is probably more accurate. They have a financial interest in every single one. I don't mean just through taxation, but through actual profit. So the fact that there may be a significant financial slash revenue interest on the part of the Chinese government in TikTok is really important to consider. It's huge when we're talking about this amount of money. And when you think about the 170 million Americans, that is an enormous chunk of the entire market share of TikTok. So, from the Chinese government point of view, there are at least two reasons to to want to hold on to TikTok as it exists today.
Hmm. And I think, Mark, am I right that Chinese law mandates that if information is requested of these companies, they provide it? I think that's another part of the kind of ownership thing that you're talking about, or something. I've seen that in a few places, that if that information, like, they can't just say no, we're not going to share that information. It's like, no, you're going to share that information. That's part of doing business in China. If we
Yeah.
request information, it has to be disclosed.
And that is my understanding as well, Bill.
Hmm.
In other words, you don't have any choice. There are not laws there that
Right.
we have here. And just to the contrary, the law says what the way you articulated it. So, um, again, it's this information gathering tool on many levels. Because when you're talking about TikTok, of course, you're talking about a lot of obviously financial transactions with Chinese companies. So there are a lot of backdoor ways. They're almost not backdoor, they're almost front doors, but there are a lot of avenues for the Chinese government to use that application to gather information, whether it's strictly for revenue purposes or something more nefarious like cyber warfare.
Right. Here's something else that kind of goes to, I don't know, maybe some scary things. And again, Mark, maybe this helps answer that question you had about nine justices being in agreement. According to TikTok, its data collection methods provide access to most content on mobile devices. The company collects sensitive data about users even when they don't save or share content. And this is from something that Tulane University put out. TikTok's privacy policy also says the company collects your email address, phone number, age, search, and browsing history information about what's in your uploaded photos and videos, and if you consent, the contents of your device's clipboard so that you can copy and paste information into the app.
Mm.
Now, this is something that I think people wouldn't be aware of, that if they breeze through those permissions, that all of a sudden anything that they cut and paste, so to speak, they put in their clipboard, all of a sudden that's uploaded automatically to TikTok, and they have a record of that.
News to me, by the way.
Right. So,
I plead
so I
ignorant.
think, just what it could be, that the Supreme Court justices are saying that, I don't know. I guess the way to put this is like, all social media has nefarious capabilities. What's the distinction is exactly what you said, which is who is an adversary, or who's controlling it or who's owning it. And I think there's almost an agreement that social media is a tool that could be used for nefarious activities or for evil. The data could be. So we have to be. That's almost a given. So we have to just look at who is in control of the data. And I want to mention, Mark, that the experience, and we've seen this with other things in the past, the user experience of TikTok in China is very different than it is in the United States.
Yeah.
The number of hours in China is the number of hours you can be on TikTok per user is restricted by the government in China.
Mhm.
And the platform is geared toward education and national pride. So that is what's being pushed on the China algorithm for TikTok. Nationalism, education. Very different, I would say, than the user experience here in the United States.
Yeah, I'd say so. We could get into that, but yeah, uh, it's very different,
Yeah.
obviously, and uh, one of the reasons for that. Well, one of the reasons, of course, is the First Amendment um, laws that we have here as far as using these platforms. I mean, and boy, could I get sidetracked here and talk about controlling social media applications, but we won't right now.
Right.
But the point is, I'm trying to make here is that, of course, China would want the use of their app to be as wide ranging as possible here. In other words, to throw the largest net possible as far as gathering information. So, not so in China. because they want to restrict free speech and they want to
Hmm.
keep people in line with their philosophies. Here's a whole different story. They want people to be as freewheeling as possible because, again, it gets more access to individuals and to general activities in the country.
So the law that we spoke about, I guess let's move on to the law. And
Mm-hmm.
you already talked about the Supreme Court decision, but this law took place on January. This law was took effect, I guess is the way to say it, Mark. This law took effect January
17th, I think. Is it 17th?
17th,
19th,
19th,
19th, 19th,
19th, a
sorry.
couple days ago, or
Uh huh.
just shy of a week ago, I guess.
Yeah.
And basically, it was divest, right? ByteDance had
Mm-hmm.
to divest itself of TikTok to a U.S. entity. So a U.S. entity had to be the owner.
Well, I think,
Um,
no, now if I, maybe you can correct me, but it had
yeah.
to be a U.S. or a U.S. ally, I believe, Bill.
Okay.
I
Okay, that
believe.
makes sense. No, that does
Yeah.
make sense. In other words, it couldn't be an adversary, right?
Correct.
That
Yeah.
makes perfect sense with what we've talked about. So ByteDance challenged this, as you said. They challenged it on First Amendment grounds, Mark. But
Mhm.
Supreme Court upheld it. No sale in sight, and there's been a lot of rumors, and we'll talk, at the end about what some of those rumors are about who may be interested. But what it sounds like to me is Chinese government or ByteDance just not interested in selling. They would,
Mhm.
at least a couple days ago, and then this changes every day, but I think their mindset was let's put pressure on the United States.
Mhm.
And how did they do that? They did that by doing something that they actually were not required to do, which was turn the app off. The law did not require them to turn the app off. They could have done a couple different things. Uh, and I guess the fines would it really it was really on service providers to not allow access to the app, right? And it couldn't be
Right.
sold in the app store, and it couldn't be updated, et cetera, et cetera. But but more or less proactively, what they said is, you know what, we're going to turn this off. And by doing that, they kind of created a bit of an
Push
uproar, right?
pushback. Yeah.
A
Exactly.
pushback, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I
You're
think
right.
that's
Uproar.
kind
Hmm.
of a tool that they're using to put pressure on the U.S. government and the people in the United States to make this an issue rather than just giving up and selling. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, look, I think this is analogous to a criminal defendant making his first appearance on
Hmm.
arraignment and then entering a plea. I don't care who you are. A good lawyer is going to always tell you to plead not guilty because if you plead guilty on day one, you're going to get you're going to get the full sentence, right? That's all there is to
Right.
it. You have to plead not guilty in order to start. First of all, discovery, all these things, but you can't get to any type of a compromise if you give in the first day. I think that's where China is right now. They're not going to say, okay, we surrender whatever you want to do in the first day. I mean, that would be absolutely ridiculous from their point of view. However, I think that with the current administration, they're in the same place. And I think,
Hmm.
in other words, they're saying, fine, we'll call your bluff. Go ahead and say no. And let's see how you feel about losing 170 million customers, so to speak. In now, in about 70 days, give or take. Let's see how you feel then. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I think that we're on just the first couple of days with this process, and
Right.
both sides are going to dig their heels in. But at the end of the day, here, someone's going to compromise. Now, here's what we have to take into consideration, Bill, from the U.S. point of view. The Supreme Court has already made the ruling
Hmm.
unanimously. It's
Hmm.
a done deal that TikTok cannot exist in the United States in its current form under the auspices of the Chinese government. It can't happen. China knows that. China knows that at the end of the 75 days, it's all over unless there's some type of a compromise.
Right.
So I think the current United States position is pretty strong because, quite frankly, the administration here really doesn't have any choice when it comes to allowing the app to exist in its current form based on the Supreme Court ruling.
Right. Here's Alan Rosenstein, former Justice Department official, and this goes to kind of what we're talking about. or what I was talking about. Now he teaches at University of Minnesota Law School. He said the law doesn't require TikTok to shut down immediately. TikTok could switch to overseas servers and provide service to the 170 million Americans who already have the app. TikTok is trying to put maximum pressure on Congress and Trump to undo the ban. And, this was a couple days ago, this quote.
Right.
So it goes to what I'm saying about trying to put pressure and the fact that they could have continued service, but said, no, let's kind of force their hand. Let's force the US's hand and see what comes of this. And they voluntarily turned it off.
Right.
And then I guess it was, I don't know, the night before or something, Trump was not yet president, but I think he provided assurances that there would be an executive order lifting the ban when he took office Monday. And I guess that was enough for TikTok, and they decided to flip the switch back on. Mm-hmm. And that's strange. I mean, I think it's kind of, can an executive order trump law and Supreme Court ratification of the law, if that's the correct term? According to the law, so in order to grant, this is what people were talking about as there was talk of this executive order being issued. According to the law, Trump would need to certify to Congress that there is a path to divestiture, mm-hmm. significant progress toward it, and the relevant binding legal agreements are in place. None of these conditions appear to be in place yet, as ByteDance has resisted a sale. So the thought is that before the executive order was issued, that there really couldn't be an executive order unless there was like a sale in progress, and they just needed more time to get the sale through. But it's tough, what actually is the executive order? The executive order is just basically that there'll be no action taken to enforce it for 75 days. That's the executive order that was signed Monday.
Correct.
Monday, what date was that? The
20th? 20th? Monday the 20th?
Monday the 20th.
Yeah. Well, I think that, a lot of this, again, we don't know what we don't know. Mm-hmm. And it's really important for all of us to, appreciate that reality. So we don't know what conversations American diplomats are having with Chinese diplomats, or maybe even Trump is having with Xi Jinping. We don't know, but I would be surprised if there are no communications at this point.
Right.
Like I said earlier, there certainly are two very clear reasons that China wants to keep the United States' use of TikTok as robust as possible. One,
and Mark, those were financial, and the second one was just the data source.
The data, the strategic, the military, however adversarial use of it. There are two reasons, and so from my point of view, and again, I hope that our listeners chime in, send us their thoughts on this, and give us their opinions. From my point of view, the way it looks now with the Supreme Court decision, that China has the choice of losing everything, TikTok not being online in the U.S. at all, or they have the option of losing, at least as far as we can tell, the strategic advantage of TikTok with cyber intel, but still retaining some financial interest in it by selling it for a lot of money to the U.S. So they have an option of good or nothing. I don't see any other outcome here. I really don't. That's my take on it. I don't know what your take is on it, Bill.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, well, look, I've seen talk of a couple deals, just to run through them, and it sounds like from what I have seen, the Trump administration is hinting at something like a 50-50 split of ownership. Mm-hmm. Kevin O'Leary made a $20 billion cash offer. ByteDance didn't seem interested in that. There was talk of Elon Musk being involved. I don't know if that's just rumors. There was talk of Jeff Bezos being involved, speculation. It sounds like Frank McCourt,
Mm-hmm.
the previous owner of the Dodgers here in
Right.
California, a billionaire, he made a very public offer, and he said he's interested in buying it. Um, what what I've seen is, yesterday I saw Bill Ford, who's on the board of directors of ByteDance. He kind of hinted at where this may be going. He said perhaps there's a fine line between ownership and control. So that was, someone speaking ByteDance. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
if there was a way to kind of extricate the control of data from the ownership piece, would it then satisfy uh, the law? Because it wouldn't be, it would be a friendly owner. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I heard that suggestion. I don't see that possibility any more than I see an ice cube in hell not melting.
Right.
I just don't, because again, I keep going back to this, and this is what I'm hinging so much on, is the Supreme Court position on this unanimous position. And if there's any hint of one finger of the Chinese government in ByteDance or TikTok, whatever it is, I don't think it's going to happen. Now, you're talking about the I forget the gentleman, the representative of ByteDance
Bill
about a
Ford.
sale. Yes,
Yeah.
saying not interested. Again, this is the initial plea from the felon arrestee,
Right.
that not,
Right.
of course they're going to say not interested.
Right.
We've all bought cars and houses and things like this, and counter offers and things like that. We don't walk in, unless you're incredibly stupid. You don't walk into the dealership and say, "Hey, what's the sticker on this?" "Oh, great, here, I'll pay full price," and blah blah. Off we go. Now you say,
Right.
"Listen, here's what I got to offer," and blah blah blah. This is how negotiations happen. They're going to say, "No, not interested on day one," but I'm telling you right now, they are more interested in giving up TikTok for a price than losing TikTok's access to all 170 million people for nothing. I can't see it any other way. I can't
Right.
see, given the stark reality of the federal court's ruling, how ByteDance slash TikTok slash the Chinese government can see any other outcome on this. Now, in a little more than 70 days, if there's something I'm not thinking of that I can't foresee or don't foresee, or I'm too stupid to foresee, and it goes a different direction, I would love the input from the audience, on your platform here, Bill. Say, "Hey, Mark, you were totally wrong." But as we
Yeah.
stand today, I can't see it going any other way.
And I see Trump kind of hinting at another thing, which is if you can alleviate the security threat portion of it, then ownership doesn't matter. And I'm not sure where that goes either, but I think it goes to this whole thing of control versus ownership. And so Mark, in 75 days, you think that that TikTok is sold, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you think TikTok is available in the United States, and it's some friendly owner of the spinoff at that point.
100%.
Okay. What do I think? Well, I don't know. I think that I think it's going to be a lot more ambiguous than that. And I only say that because I've seen instances before. And again, I don't like it, Mark, where it's lawmaking by policy memo, et cetera. There could, if the Justice Department just decides not to enforce this, right? Who sues to get it enforced? It's not a civil thing. It's almost like if the federal government, in my experience, right, didn't enforce marijuana laws for quite some time in certain areas. Was there someone suing the federal government saying you're not enforcing the laws? There really wasn't, not that I'm aware of. So what avenue do we have as citizens, or what happens next if the Justice Department just decides, yeah, okay, we're not gonna enforce this. We're not gonna fine companies for not complying. And if that's enough of an assurance for companies to keep it going, I mean, it was in the marijuana cases. They used to even write letters and say, "Hey, let us know if you would prosecute this." And
Mhm.
obviously, the government was not going to answer that specifically, but they just say, "Hey, it's not a priority." If the government says, "Hey, it isn't a priority for us to handle this," then what happens? So I think in 75 days, we see some difference, but I think it's very ambiguous about, and I think it comes down to the data, where the data is housed, how it's housed, and even right now, ByteDance claims that this data is in the United States and never leaves the United States, and I don't know if that's true or not, but
I doubt it
yeah,
seriously.
yeah, I do too. I do too.
Yeah.
So I guess we're going to have to stay tuned and find out. So let's
I,
see. Go ahead, Mark.
I wouldn't, if you wouldn't
Yeah, yeah.
mind, chime in on the enforcement. And Bill, historically speaking, about the enforcement question. What if any number of entities don't want to enforce this here in the United States?
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of pieces to that puzzle, I think. Number one, we now have a president, love him or hate him, who has openly said that he is going to deal with China through a number of avenues, and one of the most prominent is the implementation of tariffs, heavy tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
He said in his address the other day, in his press conference in the Oval Office just a couple of days ago, in regards to TikTok, that if China doesn't want to come along for the ride, then they're going to experience more tariffs. Now, again, you can love tariffs or hate tariffs or agree with them, whatever. But the point is that we know philosophically and strategically that Donald Trump wants TikTok sold. I mean, clearly he does. He's made it clear in no uncertain terms. When it comes to the agencies that have to enforce this, again, Trump has made it very clear that if people are not following his executive orders, not following the law as he sees, they're fired. And he has that authority to carry that out at certain levels. Certainly the heads of all these agencies and lower level executives in these agencies, he has 100% authority to remove them with a note. That's it. So I think there is a threat now of compliance within the federal government that did not exist maybe in the last 4 years or maybe even before that. Things are different now. So
Okay.
that's my take on that, is that China knows that Trump is going to fight on this. We'll say he won't even win. That Trump is going to make it very, very difficult for China if they don't do what he wants to do. The people within the federal government know that Trump is going to make it very, very difficult if they don't enforce the laws that he sees the Supreme Court has now made real.
Mark, do you think that there is there should be the ability to create an executive order, just in general terms, that calls for a reprieve or a delay in enforcing specific laws? Like,
Well, here's the
what
thing.
if Biden had said, "Hey, we're going to not prosecute people at the border for 75 days," as soon as he took office, or whatever?
Yes. So here's the difference. That reprieve ability was written into the law, so that the executive order does not stand by itself. It's not something
Mhm.
that President Trump pulled out of his rear end. That option was written into the law, so the president can give a 75-day reprieve.
Okay.
So he's simply acting on what's in the law. Now, I know it's kind of, and again, I'm not a lawyer, things
Yeah.
like this, but I think, I understand that it is a fairly, I wouldn't say gray area, but it's certainly nuanced. Executive order all by itself, or executive order based on what's in the law, because executive orders, the ability to issue executive orders is found in the Constitution, not in legislation.
Right.
But it does not mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, so again, those of you who are constitutional lawyers, please chime in. I want to be educated like
Right.
anybody else would. But you can also say within a law that, hey, here's the law, blah, blah, blah. Now, the law has to be constitutional.
Mhm.
So the legislatures cannot come up with a law and pass it that is unconstitutional. But executive orders are constitutional. And if a law says, hey, here's what we're going to do, blah, 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 with TikTok, and we're going to give the president the right to issue an executive order of 75 days, then he's within the law, and I think certainly within the Constitution.
Okay. So the chief thinks TikTok will be sold and it'll be here. I think it'll be here, but it may be some kind of ambiguous ownership or partnership or something. Hey, we're on TikTok, so let's hope it stays around. Maybe we'll revisit this one when there's some kind of resolution. Mark, thanks for joining me and speaking about this. Definitely a lot of different angles to it. International espionage, the Supreme Court, executive orders. It has everything that government has to offer. So thanks, folks, for joining us on this one.